My mentor, Ken Wilber, probably one of the smartest guys on the planet.
Ken is so influential that this is what Bill Clinton said about his work. This is one of the most brilliant minds I've ever come across.
He's an absolute pioneer, a visionary, a philosopher, and that barely scratches the surface of his work in the world.
And then with Ken's work, there is a requisite. You cannot just pick up any book and start reading it. You have to have already read 10 or 100 other books on philosophy or spirituality or psychology.
Hey Ken, it's Tony. There's no one like you. I think everybody knows that you're a genius.
I'm a huge fan of your work. I can't tell you how much your books have affected me. Greatest philosopher of consciousness since Freud.
His name is Ken Wilber. Maybe you've heard of him. He's revered as the Einstein of consciousness.
Awesome, Ken. Thank you for your time today.
Certainly. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. I know we're coordinating this across the world, so I'm glad we're able to get it to work.
Right.
I first came across you when I had a podcast with Dr. Alan Watkins, and you came up in conversation, and he had high praise for you, and then that catalyzed me going down this rabbit hole into researching about you, Ken, and I started watching all your different podcasts. I finished the one where you had a conversation with Dave Asprey, and I went down this rabbit hole, and at first it was hard for me to understand because I think I just didn't have that maybe level of knowledge or vocabulary. But over time, as I started listening to you talk for more and more, and maybe after 3-4 hours, I started to slowly understand the concepts you're talking about. But I can definitely feel that that gap that made it hard for me to understand all these really in-depth concepts and theories.
Right. Yeah, I can understand that. After all, I've written some 35 books on the topic. And so it's an enormous amount of material to have to take into account, even though when you get it, it starts to appear simpler and easier. And then when you really get a sense of it, it just opens up and becomes very clear what we're talking about. And what we're talking about are ways to find unity, or to find yourself one with a unified cosmos. In a certain sense, there's nothing more important than that. It's the basis of all religious experiences. For example, you have, as the Christian mystics put it, not I, but Christ lives in me. So that's an experience of a unity consciousness with spirit, or all the foundational reality. So that becomes very important to understand exactly what these different types of wholeness are, and how you can get access to them, and then how to bring them all together. So that's, in a sense, that's what I've been doing with all these books and essays and articles and so on. So I'm glad you took the time to dig into it a bit and find out what's really going on. So that's really very cool. I appreciate your effort.
No, thank you, Ken. That oneness and unity experience, is it the same as the enlightenment experience that Siddhartha, the Buddha, went through?
Yeah. That's certainly an important part of it. If you like, I can run through very quickly the different types of wholeness, and then we can see which ones are related to the Buddhist or mystical experience in general, enlightenment or waking up or awakening. And that gives us a type of wholeness that I refer to as waking up, because that's what all the world's great mystical traditions talk about, is having an awakening, an enlightenment, a oneness with the entire universe. And that oneness results in transcendence of all suffering and all pain caused by the separate self sense. And it's a very, very important part of human realities is enlightenment or awakening or experiencing the sun outside the cave of shadows. Those are all a part of what we call waking up. And that's the first sort of major type of wholeness that we find when we look at the human condition, is you can go from a sense of being asleep or not enlightened or not awakened, then everything appears separate from you and divorced from you, and a bunch of individual projects that are disconnected from each other. And then you have a waking up experience, and it's just like you've been dreaming. The world that you were experiencing starts to look like a vast dream, and you awaken to that dream, meaning that the dream has become completely whole and everything in it is unified, and you're one with the entire universe. You actually feel yourself one with everything. So you no longer look at the mountain, you are the mountain. And you no longer are aware of the stars, you are the stars. And you no longer feel the earth under your feet, you are the earth. And you no longer see the sun, you are the sun, and so on. And that's particularly well understood in Buddhism, as you mentioned, and particularly the schools of Buddhism referred to as Zen Buddhism, which developed in China about 500 AD and later moved to Korea and Japan. And they're still very influential in those cultures. And in Tibetan Buddhism, which of course took over all of Tibet and is still a very significant form of Buddhist enlightenment, waking up experiences. And in the Christian tradition, we find the whole so-called Neoplatonic tradition. And that, as the name implies, is the version that descends primarily from Plato, who had a notion of this whole world being a dream world, and that we were, like the analogy he uses, we were all caught in a cave and we're chained. So we're looking at the shadows being thrown by a real sun outside of the cave. And it hits objects and it throws shadows up against the back of the cave. And when we're forced to just look only at the back of the cave, that's all we see, are shadows. And so again, that's an example of how this world is very dreamlike and composed of nothing but illusory shadows or dreams. That's what the Buddhists call Maya, or the shadowy projective nature of the entire universe before we wake up. And in the Neoplatonic tradition, what we wake up to is the real sun shining outside. And so we walk out of our cave and into the light, literally. And that's a waking up experience. And then we see our real selves, not just the shadows cast on the rear of the cave. We find it in Judaism, known as Kabbalah, and that has a similar understanding that we're essentially all living in a dream world of shadows, but we can wake up, we can become enlightened, and then we'll experience the real sun throwing real light on us, and so we can see our real selves. And all of that, including all of the world's major mystical traditions, because they all essentially agree, and we call that version of realizing wholeness the waking up aspect of wholeness, because it's an enlightenment, an awakening, a waking up from this dream world to the world of reality. But that's not the only type of access to wholeness or unity that we have, because starting around the turn of the century, about 100 years ago, a gentleman by the name of James Mark Baldwin, who is America's second greatest psychologist after William James, who was sort of America's acknowledged psychological genius. And he was studying something that we call states of consciousness. So he wrote books with titles like The Variety of Religious Experience. And in that book, he demonstrated that virtually all the world's mystics had a similar type of experience, a waking up or enlightenment experience to a oneness with everything in the universe. And that was, it's generally referred to as a state of consciousness. We often call them today altered states of consciousness, like a psychedelic experience, for example, or a near-death experience. And those are all essentially similar. They're awakening to this vast unity or incredible oneness of all reality and a oneness with your true being. And so that was William James, what he figured out. But a very good friend of his was named James Mark Baldwin. They both taught at Harvard and hung out and were best friends and all that. But Baldwin discovered what we call structures of consciousness, not states of consciousness, but structures of consciousness. A state of consciousness is a first-person experiential reality. The first person means the pronouns like I, me, mine, that are taken from the perspective of the person speaking. Those are first-person pronouns. Pronouns taken from the second person, which is the person being spoken to, are like you or thy or thine. And those are second person perspective. And then third person is the person or thing being spoken about. So they're like he, him, they, them, it, or its. And structures of consciousness, according to James Mark Baldwin, are actual structures that are formed. And so they're like structures of grammar. We're each speaking English grammar, for example, and there's a whole system of rules and regulations that unify the English language. And so we can understand each other when we're both talking English. Of course, Japanese, Chinese, Tibetans, Germans, they all have their own unified rules of grammar or systems of grammar, and they're all third-person rules or systems or structures. And the important thing that James Mark Baldwin found is that all human beings, without exception, go through phases or stages of growth in these structures of consciousness. And so Piaget made them famous, for example, when he talked about pre-operational or magic cognition, and then concrete operational or mythic cognition, and then formal operational or third-person rationality. And then there's a pluralistic cognition, and then the highest is an integral or integrated consciousness. And we all move from birth, when we're in very pre-operational or magical stages of development, we all go through magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral. And so the integral stage of development is when we pull all of our various bits of knowledge and awareness together and realize they make a beautiful whole. There's a wholeness to the English language that fits together. And there's a wholeness to the German language that fits together. And there's a wholeness to the Chinese language. And it all fits together in a unified, beautiful wholeness. And that wholeness, because it goes through various stages of growth and development, we call them growing up types of wholeness. And each of us has not only a waking up type of wholeness available to us, which is when we wake up to our unity with the entire universe. And that's a first person, direct experiential realization. But we're also, and completely separate from our stage of waking up, we have our stage of growing up. We can be at a magical, a very childish stage of growing up. We can be at a mythic stage of growing up. We can be at a rational stage of growing up. We can be at a pluralistic stage, or we can be at an integrated stage. And each of those is a more unified, more holistic, more oneness type of experience. Then within their stages of growing up, within our cognitive intelligence, most human beings have, psychologists differ on the actual number, but most of them say we have between 8 and 12 multiple intelligences. So we have a cognitive or intellectual intelligence, we have an emotional intelligence, we have a spiritual intelligence, we have an aesthetic intelligence. And all of these, cognitive, emotional, moral, spiritual, and so on, we can become aware that we have these types of intelligence available to us. And each time we add a new type of intelligence that we understand that we have access to, we're in a sense opening up to our multiple intelligence. And that can be a very important type of increasing wholeness, or another type of unity, or another type of holistic experience of a wholeness or a oneness or a unified world. We have cognitive intelligence, we have spiritual intelligence, we have moral intelligence, we have aesthetic intelligence, and all of these are available to us. So that's a growing up, awakening up, and an opening up. And then there's two other types of wholeness that we all have available. And the next one is generally associated with the names of Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, and Freud's whole inner circle. And what Freud discovered is that we all have a mental self, which he called the I, and his translator translated as the ego self. So we all have an ego, but we can split off parts of our egoic self and repress them, push them out of our awareness, pretend like they're not ours. Like if I have anger or envy or lust or some sort of experience that I'm ashamed of or I don't like, I can push it out of my awareness into the unconscious. And there I treat it as a third person. It's like it's an exterior thing. It doesn't belong to me. And Freud is generally known for calling that region the id, the ID. But Freud, in fact, never once used the term the id, nor the term the ego. He used the German pronoun, which was the first person pronoun for the ego, which he always called the I. And then the repressed third person subject, he always called by the German third person pronoun, the it. And his translator, James Strachey, translated the it into Latin and called it the id, and translated the I into Latin and called it the ego. So, but Freud never once used the term ego or id. He actually used the I and the it, because the it was some part of the I that we had split off and pushed out of our awareness. And we no longer recognized it as part of the I. So Freud very famously said when he was asked, what does this new psychoanalysis of yours do? According to Strachey, what Freud said was, where it was, their ego shall be. What Freud actually said was, where it is, their I shall become. So he wanted us to take all of our it's, when I say the anxiety, it overcomes me, or the obsession, it's stronger than I am, or the compulsion, it overwhelms me. Those it's need to be re-identified with and taken back into the I. And that makes a whole and healthy I self or ego. That is another important type of wholeness that we get when we study things like psychotherapy or psychoanalysis and so on. And that's a type of wholeness that I call cleaning up. So we have waking up or becoming enlightened to our ultimate unity with everything. And then we have growing up or moving through our stages of growth and development to fully integrated or holistic stages. That's an important type of wholeness. Then we have a multiple intelligence awareness, which we call opening up to our different multiple intelligences. And then we have a cleaning up type of wholeness, which is where we add split off aspects or it's of ourselves to become one with that split off and repressed it. And the final type of wholeness that we have is called showing up. And showing up refers to the fact that we actually have at least 3 major perspectives available to each of our individual selves. So we have a first person, a second person, and a third person perspective. And we've talked a bit about some of these. First person is your I perspective, or me, or mine. So we are talking right now, and I am aware of my I self as I talk to you. And you are a second person in my I space. And when you talk, you assume the first person or I space, and you talk to me as a second person in your, or a you, or a thou, or a thy to your I. And then what we're talking about, whether it's a person or a thing, is our third person perspective. So if we were talking about psychoanalysis, for example, and we were using third person, so it, or they, or them, or he, or she, or something along those lines. And to be aware of all these multiple intelligences and multiple perspectives that we have, we call that showing up. And generally, we use something called a quadrant diagram, because there are 4 quadrants, and each of those are represented by a first person, a second person, a third person singular, or a third person plural pronoun. And each of those different methodologies has a very different type of epistemology, or a type of methodology that we use to gain knowledge of those perspectives. And that turns out to be showing up, turns out to be a very important part of our overall epistemological capacities. So there are 5 different types of wholeness that we have access to. And they're waking up, growing up, opening up, cleaning up, and showing up. And each one of those is a very important type of wholeness or unity experience for us. Probably the best known one is the mystical experience of oneness, or unity with the totality of existence, or God, or Tao, or Brahman, or Buddha nature, whatever term we want to use. And that's a very well known and fairly well understood state of consciousness that we have access to. So William James, in particular, America's smartest psychologist, wrote books like The Varieties of Religious Experience about various types of waking up. And they were all essentially very similar. They all had an experience of oneness with the ground of all being, or a sense of oneness of the entire universe. And that's a very important and very profound type of experience. So in Zen Buddhism, they call it having a satori. And satori means oneness with everything. So Zen is looking to generate satori type experiences. And the same is true of Dzogchen, which is looking to create a rigpa, or a oneness experience with everything. And the same with Christian mysticism. So they'll say, not I, but Christ liveth in me. It means I've disidentified with my separate I self and am now identified with my ultimate self, or my Christ consciousness. And that is an experience of oneness with ultimate reality. Waking up is a very important type of experience. And when I first started studying Zen, I was in my mid-teens. I thought to have a satori was like everything. And that if everybody in the planet had a satori, or a oneness with everything, then we would end all of our problems. But that really doesn't cover everything, because we still have to grow up, and we still can open up, and we still have to clean up, and we still have to show up. So these are all represent different types of wholeness or unity that we can have. And my various books have all dealt with one or more of these various types of wholeness or unity or holistic experiences. And I have a much better understanding of the wholeness that human beings have access to when they go through all of these 5 or so major types of unitary experiences.
Ken, a while ago, I was trying mushrooms for the very first time.
Right.
And I remember, like, maybe 2-3 hours in, I was just staring at the beautiful sunset, this feeling of, you know, everything is going to be okay. Things are going to work out. There's no need to worry. Things are okay.
Right.
And what I've been doing, especially after listening to you, I remember I was walking home last night as I was listening to you and Dave talk. I was like, okay, let's try to tap in and relive that experience I had a while back. And I was able to sort of feel how I felt at that time.
Right.
And then you guys talked about sort of trying to take away experiences from your LSD experiences.
Right.
Does that mean I should be practicing and tapping into this feeling I felt every morning as part of a meditative practice?
Well, yes, that's one good way to do it, is to practice meditation. And when you sit in meditation, you're just allowing thoughts to arise, and you're basically opening yourself up to the flood of your experience. So you might be sitting in your bedroom, sitting in a lotus position, and you're aware of the walls and aware of your bed and maybe a radio or television or some such. And you simply allow yourself to become one with every object that you're looking at. So you no longer see something, you are that something. And there's a gentleman who's a member of the London Buddhist Society, and his name is Douglas Harding. And he wrote a funny book called On Having No Head. And he actually demonstrated how this oneness experience is always happening to us because we don't have a head. Now, what he meant by not having a head was we all obviously have a head. I can see your head, you can see my head. But unlike all of my other body parts, I can't see my own head. I can see my hands, I can see my feet, my legs, my arms, my torso. I can see all of them as objects, but I can't see my own head. If I try to see my own head, all I see are like two fleshy blobs that represents my nose. So we don't have a head. What we do have sitting where we thought our head was is every object in the world we're looking at is actually sitting right where we thought our head was. So you're looking at a computer screen now, but actually that computer screen is sitting right where you thought your head was. And you're one with it. And you're always one with it, whether you realize it or not. And so when we sit to meditate, that's what we're doing. We're becoming one with every object that we thought existed out there, somewhere apart from us, but is actually sitting right here, right where we thought our head was. And that's the sun is sitting right here. The forest and the woods are sitting right here. This table is sitting right here where I thought my head was. And so that was a somewhat humorous way to talk about the fact that we're always one with everything we're aware of. And so we always have this unity experience happening to us because our awareness is always unified with everything it thought it was staring at. It's not. We're never really looking at objects as separate from us. They're all sitting right on our shoulders, right where we thought our head was. So that, anyway, some sort of something like that is the state of awareness you want to get into when you're meditating.
Ken, let's say like when I do cold showers, I have the feeling of fear. Do you sort of, when you feel feelings of fear, anxiety, do you try to feel it, let it go, ignore it, accept it, attack it with drive and focus?
Right. Basically, you're just allowing it to arise. And you're allowing it to do whatever it wants to do, but you're aware that you don't have this anxiety. You are one with this anxiety. And that just gives you a further reason to let it do whatever it wants to. So you just let it go. And the same is true if you have a fear state. You simply realize that fear state can do whatever it wants to. You are simply being aware of it. You're letting it go. And you're also realizing this essential oneness that you have with this state. And that's why you can let it go. And it'll just eventually, of course, it'll disappear. But in the meantime, you've realized that you're fundamentally one with that state, and you just can let it go as it pleases and let it do whatever it wants.
Ken, do humans have a battery of energy, willpower, motivation, and can that battery be depleted where instead of doing your work, you are now sort of chasing dopamine and jumping on social media and watching a movie because that is more pleasurable? And no matter how self-aware of that crave for dopamine you have, if your battery is empty, you crave and you cave into that dopamine.
Right. And what generally happens is you don't lose energy. You'll actually gain a type of energy because you're one with everything that's arising. And that increases your sense of energy and empowerment and strength because it's just arising as you. And therefore, if fear arises as you're really no longer afraid of fear. It's just something that is what it is, and it's arising in you, and you're simply letting it go. And when you let it go, it actually increases the amount of energy you have because you're no longer pushing against it or pulling it or trying to escape it, or you're no longer afraid of it. You are it.
Are there days that you wake up and chemically you have less serotonin, you have less, dopamine, and you just feel more sad? Is that something that is real?
Well, yes, that many people do have that type of experience. And it is a type of sadness, which is, as you say, a diminishment of certain neurotransmitters. So less dopamine, less serotonin, and therefore you feel a kind of depleted, sad state. And that's very possible. And as I say, a lot of people have that type of experience. But if you do, you simply, again, want to let it go and just sink into that state of sadness and just completely embrace it and become one with it. And then your energy will slowly start to rise.
Interesting. And Ken, what is your day-to-day like? Like when you wake up and you feel how you feel at that time of day, and then do you just sort of get straight to work and start writing and start studying?
Well, everybody is a bit different with that, but I happen to be somebody that indeed it could be in part because I identify with all of my awareness or everything that's arising. I get a great deal of energy from that state. And so I tend to just get up and go straight to my desk and sit down at my computer. And if I'm writing a book, I'll pick up exactly where I left off the day before, and I'll just start writing again. And I'll write nonstop for around 5 or 6 hours. And then I'll just sort of, okay, that's enough for the day. And I'll stop and then go on about the rest of my day, and still feeling a sense of unification with everything that's arising. That's a fairly constant state for me now, mostly because I've been meditating for probably 50 years. And so I'm fairly calm and used to that state as a common experience. And so I'll generally tend to experience it not only from the time I awaken, but I'll often have lucid dreams, which is when you dream and you know that you're dreaming because you're still identified with this ever-present awareness that you have. And so when you fall asleep, you're aware of the fact that you're falling asleep. And when you start to dream, you'll be aware of the fact that you are dreaming. And you just remain one with that awareness. And you can even go into deep dreamless sleep. And by the way, they have brain machine evidence of the fact that some people do indeed have a lucid dream state in the deep dreamless sleep state itself. So if you take somebody's brain measurements while they're in this state of awareness, they'll have a slight alpha peak, even if they're going through a theta or dream state. It'll be a theta plus a bit of alpha. And alpha is waking state awareness. And so theta, which is a dream state awareness, will be there while you're dreaming, but there'll be a small bit of alpha input because you have this wakeful awareness that's also present. And then when you go into deep dreamless sleep, theta will drop out, alpha will drop out, beta will drop out. And the deep dream state, which is marked by a delta state of awareness, you'll get a delta rise, but you'll also have a small alpha peak from waking awareness. So there's a waking awareness being added to your delta or deep sleep formless awareness. And you're actually aware of the fact that you're not aware of anything. It's a formless state. And you're just aware of this vast formless emptiness. And that you are sort of, quote, aware of. When I generally wake up, I'm still in a continuous state of waking awareness. And I'll just wake up and very quickly fall in to that waking awareness state, or being aware of awareness. If I'm, as I say, if I'm writing a book, I'll just get up, and in that state, I'll continue, but I'll be writing in that state. And that goes on for 5 or 6 hours. And then I'll just stop writing for the day and go on about whatever I'm going to do.
Do you have the ability to control what time you wake up and the length of your sleep? Like, let's say every day you wake up at 7. Are you sort of usually naturally waking up at 7 consistently, or does your body...
I wake up consistently at around 4 o'clock.
Okay.
I just, that's the habit that I've fallen into. And in part, it's because I do maintain a constant contact with this wakefulness awareness. And so when I wake up at 4 o'clock, it's not like I'm changing fundamental states, because the state that I'm already in is a waking state awareness, even when I'm in deep formless sleep or lucid dreaming in a dream state. I'm still fundamental, basic wakefulness is my condition. And so that's what I'll tend to experience. And because I was experiencing that, I tended to actually physically wake up at earlier and earlier times. So there was a time during my life, and again, it's been about 50 years that I've been meditating, and I would tend to physically wake up about 7 o'clock, and then that eventually became 6 o'clock, and then 5 o'clock, and it's now around 4 o'clock. So that's just the way my habit has unfolded, and the way the presence of this waking state has influenced me.
So let's say you sort of naturally wake up at 4 and you sort of keep that state of mind and you go straight to work. What happens on the days where you naturally or accidentally wake up at 2 a.m.? Do you then look at the clock, oh, it's too early, let's get it an extra 2 hours, or do you still get up?
Well, I'll occasionally get up, but most of the time I'll just turn over and try to go back to sleep. So then that means that my body will go through experiencing a beta state during waking, to a theta state during dream, to a delta state during deep dreamless sleep. And that's because those are the natural states of consciousness that a human organism goes through. And so I continue to go through those natural states. But as I've got better and better at touching into this wakeful awareness, I stayed more in touch with the wakeful portion of each of those different stages of sleep.
Now, Ken, I can't lucid dream, and when I'm in the dreams, I'm not sort of self-aware that I am dreaming. But I've been, over the last year, I've been writing down my dreams when I wake up as I remember them before they sort of disappear. And these dreams, like, what are they? It feels like me in a parallel universe where I retain all my experiences of that version of me, and different variations, different dreams have different variations of my friend's circle in my life, but they all have similarities of me being me. Like, what are dreams?
Right. Well, if you look at the world's great mystical traditions, such as Vedanta or Tibetan Vajrayana, Tibetan Buddhism, or Zen Buddhism, they maintain that the human being has 5 states of consciousness. And those are called waking, dreaming, deep formless sleep. And then the 4th state is called Turiya, which is just the Sanskrit word for the literal word fourth, because it's our 4th major state. And so they just call it the 4th, or Turiya. And what it is an ever-present true self witness awareness. So right now, when you're aware of what's going on around you, you have 2 selves, according to the mystical tradition. One, you have your small ego self, the I self, and you can be aware of that. You can introspect, you can see it as an object, you can feel it, and so on. But when you become aware of this small self of yours, the witness of that small self is the big self, the Brahman Atman, the true witness. And that's the true self that you will wake up to when you have your waking up experience, your Satori experience. Zen calls it your original face, and it's held to be eternal. So a famous Zen koan says, show me your original face, the face you had before your parents were born. And the reason that you have this true self or original face before your parents were born is that, as we just saw, it's an ever-present state. You're always aware of the unity of your awareness with everything that appears as an object out there. It's actually happening right here. It's actually sitting on your head where you thought your head was, and that's because it's one with that supreme self. Those are 5 major states of consciousness that we have. And the 2 highest, Turiya and Turiyatita, or the 4th and 5th state, those are called ultimate states because they are actually our ultimate self, the true Brahman Atman, our true self. And in the 4th state, we experience just the pure witness. It's also sometimes called absolute subjectivity because it's our true subject that's just ever presently aware of everything that's arising. And that's our true self. And then the 5th state is that true self, but in its non-dual form. In other words, we go back to the 4th state, and it feels like we're aware of everything that's arising. We see that as an object, and we can be very clearly aware of that. But in the 5th state, that object, that subjective self, that pure subject self becomes one with all of the objects that it's aware of. That's when it all appears to arise on this side of your face where you thought your head was. That's Turiyatita. That's a oneness of your subjective self and every object it's aware of. So those are ultimate states because they represent absolute reality, or Godhead, or Brahman Atman, or the Tao, or Buddha nature in us. Then the 3 lower states, the gross waking state, the subtle dream state, and the causal deep dreamless state, those are all relative states because they all produce different types of relative objects. And a relative object is an object we think is separate from us. We are seeing it as an object. And there are 3 types of those objects: for the gross, subtle, and causal objects. So a gross object is a material object that we think we're looking at out there. So this computer screen is an example of a gross object. A subtle object are the type of objects we produce in the dream state. And they're an important type of objects because we see them as objects. I mean, when we dream, we're seeing an objective world. We think it's real. It seems to be really there. Those are all subtle objects. And those subtle objects are dream objects. That's what the dream is the production of these subtle sphere objects. And the subtle sphere also includes all of our subtle energies that we produce in our bodies, like Kundalini energy. And subtle energy gives us our subtle body, that when we're in a dream state, we actually can be aware of our subtle bodies, where we think we have a body when we're dreaming. I mean, we're aware of ourselves and we have a body, but it's not an objective body. Nature isn't even present in the dream state. Gaia is gone. There's just a subtle body and subtle states and subtle energies and subtle objects. And those subtle objects are all the objects we directly see in our dream state. And that's what the dream state is all of our subtle objects. Now, Freud and many other Western psychologists have hooked dream state with the unconscious. And the only reason they do that, the great mystics of the world have also united the subtle body with our subtle unconscious being. And that's why most people don't remember their dreams, because they immediately split them off and dump them in their unconscious it or id or subconscious awareness. But that's what the dream state is. It's the product of our subtle body, our subtle self, our subtle awareness. And it actually manufactures all these subtle objects on a nightly basis. And then the deep formless state, the causal deep dreamless state, is just the production of formless, objectless phenomena. And we just experience that as being an emptiness, an empty, formless awareness. And as I say, if we keep our lucid dreaming awareness into the deep, formless sleep, that's what we'll recognize. It's just a vast, formless emptiness with nothing in it at all. But we're aware of this emptiness. And the Buddhists actually call their ultimate reality by the name shunyata, which means emptiness, because that's what ultimate reality is. It's infinite, it's enormous, it's ever present, and therefore it doesn't appear as any gross object or material thing or event, and it doesn't appear as any subtle object, or it's not a dream object that we can see or feel or be aware of. It's just a vast, formless emptiness. And that's the third of our three relative states of awareness that the mystical traditions maintain we all have. That's where your dreams come from.
I love that answer. Ken, how do you integrate that feeling of oneness towards your everyday? For example, as I'm listening and talking to you, you're sort of helping me tap into this present sort of focused state, and I'm really feeling how I'm feeling. But then after this call, I'll go back to work, I'll go to a meeting, and this feeling that I'm feeling would just sort of go away, and it's sort of like I turn into a robot and it's like back to work.
Right. Well, practice makes perfect. And so as you get into this unity state that we're talking about, whatever method you use to get into it, whether it's just listening to me talk or whatever, to the extent that you can recall that state at all and rest in it when you meditate, that's going to give you the muscles to maintain that state. And so it's by practicing that state unity experience as long as you can or as frequently as you can, or just relatively regularly. I mean, even if you only do it for 10 or 15 minutes a day, do it every day and don't miss a single day. And you'll find the more you do it, the easier it is to maintain it and to get into it and stay in it. So that's what Zen Buddhists are doing. That's what Vedanta Hindus are doing. That's what Taoists are doing. And that's what Christian mystics are all doing. And Kabbalah, they're all training themselves to get out of the cave of shadows and into the real light outside the cave, and therefore to stop seeing nothing but shadows everywhere. And the more that you can get in that state and then keep it for even 5 minutes after you get up from meditation, if you can keep that awareness for even 5 or 10 minutes, that's a great achievement. It's a great accomplishment. And you should be very happy about doing something like that. Because as you'll find, the more you get used to this state, it really is, well, the great Eastern traditions call it Sat, Chit, Ananda. Sat is being, Chit is consciousness, and Ananda means bliss. And this ultimate state of oneness is called being, consciousness, bliss. And it's very much ultimate being, or a unity of everything. And it's very much the highest consciousness you can get into as a human being. But more than being and consciousness, it's blissful. It's simply, you feel happy all over. And it's a wonderful feeling. And so that's what you want, is to get as much Ananda, bliss, in your system as you can. And that's why the mystics always talk about love and compassion and bliss and all these very positive emotions. And they equate those 3 very positive emotions with ultimate reality itself. So that's the way ultimate Brahman is defined, as Sat, Chit, Ananda, being, consciousness, bliss. So practice it.
Got it. As you were earlier talking about sort of finding that true self, that version of you before you were born, I'm assuming that everyone probably has a unique true self. Animals have a unique true self. Like, what creates that true self? Like, why were you given your set of worldviews and assets and skills, and who created that? And can you take any credit? Like, as I'm thinking, can I take credit for the hard work or the business I built, or did I just get lucky because I got given this true self that was hard coded with these sort of curiosity sort of traits?
Right. Well, it's sort of difficult to put into words. And we all know that most of the mystics talk about realities that are so-called ineffable or can't be described. All of Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, which is the second major form of Buddhism after so-called Theravadan or Hinayana Buddhism, which was the original form that Buddha taught. But then some 600 years later, a guy named Nagarjuna came along, and he invented non-dual Buddhism. And that was the Buddhism that experienced ultimate unity awareness. It's what we're calling the 5th state of consciousness. Whereas Buddha basically gave us up to the 4th state, when we transcended our little self, or anatta, or atman, and discovered our big self, or the 4th state of consciousness, our pure witnessing awareness. But then Nagarjuna pushed further and found that underneath that pure, true, absolute, subjective witnessing self, there was a non-dual unity center of being. And that is your true self. Now, the overall number of true selves in the entire universe is one. So we are all plugged into the same ultimate self-consciousness. There's just one of it, and that's why we all feel one with each other when we have an enlightenment or awakening experience. You feel one with everything, including you feel a deep oneness with all other human beings. In fact, all conscious animals, they're called sentient beings. Sentient means conscious, and being means a living organism. And you feel one with all sentient beings. And that's because it's said that all sentient beings, even a dust worm, has Buddha nature. In other words, it's plugged into this infinite consciousness of the being, consciousness, bliss, variety. But the overall number of consciousness, well, even Erwin Schrödinger, the founder of modern quantum mechanics, said the overall number of minds, meaning big consciousness, in the entire universe is but one. So that's the founder of modern quantum mechanics. And he, by the way, was a very profound Vedanta believer. He talked about the one self, wrote about, quoted the Upanishads and Vedanta all the time. There are people that frequently talk about quantum mechanics being mystical. They almost always are referring to somebody like Erwin Schrödinger, who was very mystical and of a particularly Vedanta variety. And according to him, the overall number of consciousnesses is but one. And he had a profound Satori-like consciousness experience himself. And he wrote about it. And he was a very, very good writer. And so, of course, he invented the Schrödinger wave equation, which is the main form that modern quantum mechanics takes. It was simultaneously invented by Heisenberg and Schrödinger. But Heisenberg invented a version of the quantum mechanical wave state that was based on a very complex S matrix. And Schrödinger showed that that complex S matrix could be written in the simplified integral calculus form, a simple wave form. And so that's the form that's always used in today's modern quantum mechanics. And it did happen to come from one of the world's great, great mystical thinkers. So to that extent, quantum mechanics is mystical. But to the other stuff, trying to theoretically connect how it describes reality with an ultimate reality, that doesn't work very well. But that's neither here nor there. I meant to say that part of the reason that some of these things are very difficult to talk about is that when you get beyond gross, subtle, and causal relative states, the ultimate states are, again, the Buddhists actually call them shunyata, which is Sanskrit for emptiness. Nagarjuna stated it as follows: take X to mean anything you want to be ultimate reality. So X could be God or Tao or Brahman or Godhead or Jesus or whatever name you want. And he showed through very elaborate logical demonstration that ultimate reality was neither X nor not X, nor both, nor neither. I mean, that wipes out your choices. What can you say about ultimate reality? That's what you can say about it. Zip, bupkis, nothing. And that's what Zen, of course, made fairly famous, Zen emptiness. And Zen koans are all talking about ultimate, unified, pure, formless emptiness. And that's what all found by Nagarjuna, this brilliant Buddhist logician and mystic thinker. So it makes it a little bit hard to describe all of these states and so on. But you getting the general picture of why it's hard.
Recently, I've been sort of having this fascination with ancient history and learning about the Egyptians and learning about the possibility of the pyramids being way older than 10,000 years and potentially being 100,000 years, and it being a previous civilization that disappeared, and the Egyptians that we now know of came into and saw the pyramids already pre-existing there. And it sort of made me sort of think, like, you know, what you do, your name, your legacy, you know, it might last for 50 years, 100 years, 1,000, maybe 10,000. It probably wouldn't last 100,000 years, and it will sort of disappear, and what you do in this 100 years sort of will just sort of vanish in 100 years' time. Right. I guess, then what motivates you to continue writing books, continue learning, continue growing, versus sort of just delve yourself into sort of the state of happiness and consume dopamine and just be happy for 100 years?
Right. Well, I guess in part, a large measure of it is the happiness that I'm able to generally transmit to others who really get the point and get why it's all pure emptiness, but you're one with all of it. Most people I know that get that general type of integral understanding are very happy about it. I mean, there is a being, consciousness, bliss aspect to it. And I guess I keep writing and trying to talk about it as clearly as I can because of the number of people that I'm able to reach when I do that. So it's not uncommon for me to sell, for example, 100,000 copies of books. And that's fairly rare, particularly for the somewhat academic books that I tend to write. So 100,000 copies of books is very rare. Again, particularly for slightly academic talk. But I keep doing it because I do sell 100,000 copies. And so I know I'm reaching a fair number of people, and I hear from many of them a lot, especially because they can get my email, and I'll get email letters and stuff like that. And I'm always glad to hear about that and to get those types of email. And I guess that's one of the main reasons that I keep doing it, even though, like you say, my actual legacy could be 10 years or 50 years or maybe 100 years and not much more. And I just no way I can know that. And so it doesn't really enter my awareness as something I'm going to calculate and say, oh, I'm only going to last for 20 years after I die, so I'm just going to give up on it. I don't want to do this anymore. That's not a conscious thought that I can have because I just can't know.
Ken, given that when you sort of tap into that state of unity, technically you can sort of work 18-hour days and be constantly recharged and just write all day long, versus, you know, spending time with family, speaking with your readers.
Right.
When you sort of unlock that state of mind, is balance needed? And why or when would you sort of take a break from work if you could work forever?
Right. Well, when I started getting into being able to recognize the unity state fairly often, I often did work 18 hours a day simply because I could. And so I would find myself up at all hours. And when I'd wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, I'd get up and start writing or start working. And I'd go for 10, 15, 20 hours a day. And then as I started sort of balancing that out, and which I did predominantly through things like weightlifting, which just gave me a very good overall balance because when you're actually lifting weights, you're doing something with your physical body in the physical world. And that helped to sort of balance me out. And then I started sort of sleeping later in my physical body. So I would still have an awareness through all three waking, dreaming, deep sleep states, but I would physically wake up, like actually stop dreaming and stop deep formless awareness and actually come to a waking state in my own bodily awareness. And then I would actually wake up from whatever sleeping I was doing. The time that I would do that became sort of longer and longer till it's like around 4 o'clock now, where there were times in the past where I would wake up at 1 or 2 o'clock and just get up and start working. So
how many hours of sleep do you get, Ken? And do you feel the sort of effects of getting less sleep, given that you can tap into these different states? Do you feel a physical exhaustion that slows your brain sort of ability to sort of...
Yeah. Well, I tend to fall asleep fairly early, so around 10 o'clock, and I sleep till around 4, so that's 6 hours of sleep, and I usually get around 6 hours. If I get less, I don't really feel that much tired, because I can plug in to this ever-present awareness. And so even if I wake up at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, I won't feel depressed or depleted or lacking in sleep. That doesn't generally happen to me anymore.
Ken, why does that sort of unity state of feeling your brain's exhaustion, feeling the down, feeling the sadness, sort of ironically give you energy?
I don't know that those states actually give me energy, but they don't detract from my energy. So I just basically am very wakeful. And that stays with me, no matter how much I actually sleep.
Recently, I've been sort of practicing some breathing exercises and been doing this Wim Hof breathing where I sort of do deep exhales and inhales, and I try to hold my breath for as long as possible.
Right.
And I am able to sort of try to clear my brain and sort of clear what's happening in my head, but I'm struggling to have a control over my body. I have no idea on how to slow my heart rate down. It feels like that's a completely different skill.
Right. Well, in a sense, it is, but in a sense, it's also the case that practice makes perfect. So somebody that is very, very knowledgeable on breath work is a researcher by the name of Stan Grof, Grof. And Stan started out working in the 60s when psychedelics like LSD were legal. And Stan worked with hundreds of different students, and he would give them all psychedelic amounts of psychedelics. In other words, you can take different amounts of a psychedelic drug, and when you take an upper reach amount of it, then you'll tend to have the typical psychedelic experience of you transcend your ego, your small self, you get rid of it, you break it down, and you expand to experience the oneness of yourself, of the entire universe. And Stan had more clinical evidence on how psychedelics would induce these mystical experiences than anybody alive. And then, of course, the US government, being our government, did the stupid thing and made LSD and many other psychedelics illegal. And so Stan could no longer legally work with this stuff. He might still work with people doing trips, but it was all hush hush and kept secret and so on. But what he did do is he developed a sequence of breath exercises that he calls holotropic breathwork. And this is basically deep breathing and deep exhaling. And you keep doing that for a certain amount of time, at least usually 15 minutes or so. And it will get you into an actual psychedelic state. You'll actually have these transcendent unity experiences from just this breath work alone. And he's written a lot about that, about how to do it. So I would recommend, if you want to pursue that, that you look up his books, and you can get them off the internet or any place you want. But Stan is a great guy. I've known him for a really long time. And he always, when he sort of made a map of the different degrees of psychedelic experience, he would always produce a map that had various states of consciousness that were always almost identical to the maps I had come up with from studying all the mystical experiences worldwide. So I would take Zen maps and compare them with Vedanta maps and compare them with Christian mystical maps. And it always come up with what's called a great chain of being, which a simple Christian form goes matter to body, to mind, to soul, to spirit, which is from the lowest and most fragmented states of consciousness through bodily, living, breathing states of consciousness, to mental states of consciousness, to soul or transcendental states of consciousness, to spirit or ultimate states of consciousness. And those always match Stan's maps. And so we saw always sort of an inside joke we had about, oh, somebody else wrote another paper on how you and I have the same ultimate maps of consciousness. Ha, ha, ha. Isn't that funny? But he's a terrific guy, and he's a good friend of mine. And I very much recommend his work. So you can check that out. And the more you practice doing that, the more you'll get a sense of how it affecting various bodily parts and the actual effect it's having on them. So I think it'll answer a lot of your questions.
Ken, when you previously mentioned that when you sort of feel and you sit into your feelings, whether it's fear, anxiety, depression, it doesn't detract your energy and you sort of can stay at baseline. What then gives you energy? What recharges you?
Well, I'm sort of introspecting to get a sense of it. And it seems to just be this fountain of bubbling wakefulness. And it just seems to be an interior state that I'm plugged into from practicing it so long. Like I say, I'm 74 years old now, and I started meditating when I was in my very early 20s, actually late teens. So I've been practicing these states for at least 50 years. The more I got in touch with those inner fountains of consciousness and fountains of energy, the more energized it just naturally made me feel. And so I feel that it's just an inherent inner fountain of wakefulness that all people have access to, but not everybody has awakened to or is enlightened about. But again, the more you practice, whatever form of meditation you're practicing, the more you'll get in touch with that inner fountain. And therefore you'll feel it as a source of energy.
Ken, something that is curiously going through my mind is, what is the dynamic that you have, or what is it like when you are sort of connecting or talking with gurus? Like, what would it be like if Ken is sitting across the Dalai Lama. Like, what is that conversation like? Are you guys completely in relation and understanding each other's sort of thoughts? What is that dynamic like in experiences that you've had with gurus?
Right. Well, if we decide to talk about our inner experience, it very much shares a common reality. So I'll talk about how myself feels, and then he'll talk about how his self feels, and then we'll notice the similarities and kind of connect. And otherwise, in many cases, we just find ourselves talking about just mundane, everyday stuff. And we don't just get right to the heart of the matter and start talking about our Satori experiences or something like that. If I'm with a teacher and we're directly talking about those types of events, then we'll directly talk about it. I mean, after all, I'm there to learn something about them from this teacher. And so I'll ask direct questions having to do with that inner state. At that point, it becomes a very commonly shared experience, because I have, after all, experienced quite a bit of that stuff over my 50 years of practicing it. So I have a fair amount to say back to the teacher.
That is super cool. Ken, are there any sort of current daily practices or meditative processes that you still perform and practice today?
Yeah. My basic form of practice is found in Dzogchen and in Zen and in certain forms of Vedanta. And it's just a witnessing awareness where you simply sit down in your meditative posture and allow whatever comes to your mind to come to your mind. And you just sit with it, you witness it, you allow it to arise, to stay a bit and go, or not as it wants. And it's literally resting as that ultimate fourth state awareness of pure witness, the fourth state being Turiya. And then usually after I've done that for a while, I'll flop into a fifth state where I just become one with everything that's arising. And that's still as far as I can tell, that is the highest state that humans can achieve, is the state of pure unity consciousness. And when I'm in that state, I just rest in that state. And that's the practice that I've been doing for about 20 years now.
And Ken, do you do that before you sleep, when you wake up, and how long does it take for you to tap into the fifth state, and how long do you sit in there? Do you have a timer?
I don't generally have a timer, but I usually sit for close to an hour or so. And it doesn't take me very long to get into a fifth state when I start in the fourth state. And I'll start just by witnessing, because I can witness now at any time and for as long as I want. And so I'll start by getting into that fourth witness state, and I'll just stay there until I literally fall out of it and fall into the fifth state. And that's like just falling off the log and becoming one with the water behind you. And that's the general form that my practice takes now.
Do you routinely do it at the same time each day, or is it randomized?
It's randomized, but it tends to focus on early morning. And then sometimes I'll do it in the late evening as well. But if I do it at all, I'll do it relatively early, around 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning.
And then Ken, do you feel like with each generations, humans will evolve and naturally tap into these fourth and eventually fifth states, and will we eventually turn into these aliens that can use telepathy and talk to each other with our minds?
Who knows? I mean, I would expect that somebody who would be evolved enough to actually be an alien and to have the technology to move themselves hundreds of light years from one planet to a next would certainly be aware of some higher states of consciousness. After all, it's often called the perennial philosophy because, and I mean, that's what William James called it. And it's called the perennial philosophy because it shows up everywhere on the planet. Every major culture has access to these meditative or higher states of awareness. And we find them in every culture that we've ever looked. And all the mystics the world over have essentially same experiences of unity consciousness or perennial philosophical awareness. And so it would be hard for me to imagine some alien culture that wasn't aware of the highest states that we were aware of. So I got to think that that's probably one of the things that we're going to assume aliens have. And by the way, because of research being done at Princeton and a few other very elite Ivy League institutions, they're actually doing research on psilocybin and other psychedelics. And so we're having very advanced research being done on these higher states of consciousness. And that was what sort of upset me about my psychedelic generation, is we sort of got into psychedelics in the early 60s, but by the late 70s, we had dropped out of it. And we just seemed to not talk about it very much anymore. And we certainly weren't doing it as much. And that really disappointed me because I never myself got into very much of the psychedelic experience. But I was really glad it was there because many great philosophical writers and thinkers had actually taken psychedelics and become aware of this mystical tradition. So really great writers like Aldous Huxley and Alan Watts had all extensive experience of psychedelics and the mystical experience that they induce. And I thought that was just the best news in the world. And for like during most of the 60s and early 70s, we had like psychedelic art and psychedelic experiences and people talking about it and writing about it. And it was a very advanced type of understanding of what it was possible for human beings to experience because it was psychedelic experience. And then when that started just dropping out and dropping away from our consciousness, I was really quite upset, even though I was never that much into it myself. I was delighted that that we were culturally aware of it, and we had culturally really experienced it to a significant degree. And I liked that. I thought that was great.
Ken, as we've been talking, you know, I've been needing to go to the restroom and I've been feeling my bladder, and then I've been sort of exercising what you've been talking about, just feeling it, accepting, sitting into it. Then the bladder sort of settles and I'm listening to what you talk about. And then as I get a bit more distracted, I start feeling my bladder and I'm feeling that pain and I'm having to sit into it. And as I'm talking now, it sort of disappears, but I know that the moment I start listening and maybe 2-3 minutes in, it'll start, like, what is happening there? It's a bit of me not being able to focus, me not having control over my biological body? What's happening?
Right. Well, it's just a matter of where you're able to put your attention and keep it. And as we talk about things that are interesting to you, then that's where your attention goes. And so it goes away from your bladder and its urgency or its pain or whatever it's doing. And you're simply drawn into the interesting aspects of our conversation. And also when you're then practicing the sort of unity state, then you're getting into that state. And so that's great. I mean, I'm glad.
Recently, I have some Christian friends that I talk to on a regular basis, and I don't really sort of believe, or I don't think there's this man sort of looking over us, but I've been sort of trying something new where it's like, hey, like I haven't experienced prayer. Can you show me how you pray? And then we've been sort of praying together, praying to God, praying for each other's health. And there's this sort of, I tap into this sort of different state where it's like, I'm letting go of the ego, letting go of the pride, putting faith in this greater being. There's this feeling of kindness as I'm praying for someone else. What is that place I'm tapping into as I'm praying with my friend?
Yeah, everything you said is true. And that's why you're experiencing what you're experiencing. There really is an ultimate reality. And you can open yourself to it by talking to your friends about how they get into it and what they do when they pray. And then when you give your compassion and your concern and your care to other people, that's a notorious enhancement of unity experiences. So, I mean, it's basically what all mystics the world over do. So the Buddhists have their compassion, the Christians have their love, and love and compassion are two very powerful inducements of this unity experience. Because when you're caring for another person, a separate person from you, you're actually connecting to your unity that you share with that person. And so that's going to naturally get you to experience this unity more clearly and more strongly and with more awareness. Your entire explanation of what you were doing and why it was happening, everything you said is true. So you were giving a very accurate explanation of what's happening.
Ken, what's your thoughts on children? Do you have children? What's your thoughts on bloodline? Like I remember 3, 4, 5 years back, I thought that, I've been blessed with this opportunity to experience and play life. And I know that the moment you have children, you sort of are less selfish and now it's about them and not you. And, they take up a large amount of your time. I was like, I want to make the most out of the 100 years. So I'm not going to have children. But recently, I don't know if my ambitions have sort of changed. I do have the urge for children. I guess that pendulum might swing back and forth. But what are your thoughts on children?
Do you have a girlfriend?
I do not.
Okay. Have you had girlfriends in the past?
No, not someone that I've been close with.
Do you want to have a girlfriend?
Society, my environment has sort of made me think that I'd want a girlfriend. At the current present, I am pretty happy and content with where I'm at. During periods of loneliness and dips in my mental state, I might want the comfort of a best friend, someone to be with me, but normally I think no.
Are you gay?
I'm pretty sure I'm not.
Yeah. Well, what you think about children is often tied up with what you think about a romantic partner. So people that have romantic boy-girl partners tend to think about children simply because they think about sex and they're having sex and she could get pregnant at any time. And what am I going to do if that happens and so on? But you can also be gay and think about children. And in that case, you can end up adopting kids, for example. Are there any number of ways that gays can have children? Children are a sort of special set among things that you can get involved with, because they really do demand a certain amount of attention from you. And that means a certain amount of love and compassion and care and concern. And all of those will indeed, well, if you've been thinking about children recently, then those kinds of thoughts have been going through your mind. So you're thinking, what if I do have kids, or I end up with the little brats one way or another? What do I do? And it's very true. I mean, I don't have children, although I've always had a girlfriend. I've always been in some sort of heterosexual relationship. And I've been married several times and often thought about the possibility of having children when I was in a relationship. And I do know that they really do demand an enormous amount of your time and awareness and energy. And that's just unavoidable. Particularly if you're going to be anywhere near a decent parent, you're going to want to be giving them a lot of time and attention and awareness and love and care and concern and so on. And oddly, the perennial philosophy doesn't say much about kids. It doesn't say, oh, it's good to have them. It doesn't say, oh, it's bad to have them. It doesn't say, oh, you should have them and love them. And it doesn't say, oh, you should have them and not love them. It just doesn't really say much at all about kids. Very few of the world's great mystical beings have had children. And in part, it's because they devote their time to the Godhead or to a meditative path that takes up much of their time. And so that's what they end up thinking about. But what you end up doing, I have no set of advice or course of recommendation. I myself have not had kids, and in large measure, that was a choice. I mean, I've always been fairly happy with not having children. And I'm still essentially that way. And so I doubt I'll be having any. I'm getting a bit old for that as well. So,
Ken, when it comes to finding a partner, having girlfriends, did you find it hard to find someone that could be your best friend, could be someone that you can spend a large amount of time with, especially how, you know, in the bell curve of humans, you're at the very tippy top?
Right. Yeah, and it's always been sort of hard to find somebody who is as interested in meditation as I was. And that's why a fairly high percentage of my girlfriends are women that I would actually meet at meditation retreats. And we were both interested in it. And so things would work out quite well. And I had 3 or 4 very long-term relationships with women I met at meditative retreats. That sort of took care of that problem. And I was very happy that it worked out that way.
Ken, do you ever ask yourself why or how you got lucky, or how you got to the end of the bell curve, or how you got that initial catalyst of curiosity to search into, figure out like why? Is that something you ever, and you look at the person next to you and they unfortunately wasn't given the same sort of code?
Right. Well, I sometimes think about it theoretically. when I'm trying to picture the relationship between the ultimate real self and the small or relative self. Because this all the, if you will, gifts that I've been given are essentially gifts that my small self has. So whether it's a high IQ or mathematical, those are all have to do with my relative self. And so I've always been toying with, well, how do you get this relationship between the big self? Because there's only one big self. All mystics worldwide agree that we all share one ultimate self. And so I understand that part of us, and I can experience that part, and I know it's real, and I know it's there. But exactly how it influences the small relative self is really open for a lot of theoretical debate and discussion. And so I think about that when I'm working on writing that deals with that topic. And so that's the point that it comes up, and that's the point that I tend to think about it. And then I will think, well, how did I luck out and get a fair amount of these big self gifts into my small self that I could express? And that is sort of a mystery, that part. I mean, I've got some wild ideas, but they're all theoretical. So I really can't say with certainty.
Ken, when you're at the fringes of existing knowledge, how do you learn? How do you gain knowledge? Is it all self-thinking and you just sort of talking with yourself? Are you sort of looking at different fields of life and sort of talking to experts when it comes to cooking, when it comes to sort of cells within plants, and then maybe takeaways from there you can apply to your sort of field? How do you learn?
Well, first of all, I read an enormous amount. I've really got thousands and thousands of books, and I've read them all, and I've marked them all up with, 2 or 3 underlined versions and so on. And then I talk to myself. So a lot of the original impetus or input for the ideas comes from this reading. And I've read just about every mystical writer in the world, and most of the philosophers as well. So I get a lot of input from these great writers. And then I just talk to myself about it. They haven't all got it all figured out. And that's what I'll have to talk to myself about. Well, he said this is true, but that doesn't really seem to work out very well. So how could it work out better? And then I talk to myself and I think up better ways to do it. And that's where the bulk of my original quote unquote knowledge comes from, is the self-talking.
Ken, with each generation, given that you only have 100 years and maybe that would only allow you to read 10,000 books, if every generation reads 10,000 books because that's the only amount of time they have, how could each generation grow? I guess you need a better selection of the 10,000 books that you choose to read. How do you then select the books that you choose to read?
Right. Well, I get it because when I read certain books that are influential on me, those writers will almost always be telling you who their influences were. And I always go and check their influences out, because that's how they got to be so smart, was by reading these people. Then they tell you who the people are that they read. And so I track them down and buy their books and read them all. That's the only way I can figure it's going to go forward. Like if somebody gets into my stuff, they'll end up noticing all of the writers that have had an influence on me. And presumably some of them will go run those folks down. That's almost the only way I can think about how this overall growth of knowledge is going to occur, is reading the people that we read. And that'll work out or it won't. And so we'll see how it goes.
Ken, a recent parallels that I've been sort of trying to wrap my head around is how the universe has a very similar parallel to the neural networks in your brains. And I've been thinking of how, like, you know, the universe could be in this sort of water droplet that is dropping on the floor, and the water droplet's expanding, and within the water droplets there's all these molecules, and there's always these parallels, things within a thing within a thing.
Well, yeah. And I don't know what that's supposed to mean, except that intelligence is universal. It just shows up everywhere, in star systems, in woods, in forests, in animal species. It's just always some intelligent form of life going on. And yeah, it happens in the universe all over. And that's because the universe is being, consciousness or mind, and bliss. And that's exactly what it's made of. And those three ingredients always show up wherever life exists. So every life form we can think of has a being and a mind and a joy or a bliss part to it. And that will simply continue indefinitely, as far as I can tell.
Ken, given that you sort of write 5 to 6 hours a day, where do you invest the remaining 12 hours you have each day, usually nowadays?
Well, if I'm not actually reading, I'm usually doing something like watching movies. I really like movies. I get off on it's sort of condensed human experience goes into each movie. And I like seeing how different people experience reality. So I watch a lot of television for the movie experience. Otherwise, I'm lifting weights or riding a bike or going for a walk in nature or something like that. Just sort of ordinary, everyday reality kind of things.
And Ken, when you go to sleep and you dream and you lucid dream, are you tapping into a second part of your life where within the lucid dream you're actively doing something, or are you actively just sitting in nothingness?
Well, during the lucid dream, I'm doing something. And it's often a very ordinary, everyday something that my brain, because it engages in these everyday experiences, produces dream memories about them. And so when I'm in a dream state, I'm always doing something. I'm riding a bike or cooking or watching movies or reading or something. And then in deep dreamless sleep, I'm just in formless nothingness. So I'm never doing anything in deep formless sleep. And then when I wake up, I'm about to get up. And so I'll be doing something, either meditating or writing is probably the most common thing that I do with my waking hours. Because when I'm working on a book, I write for 6 or 7 hours a day, and I'll just do nothing but write when I'm writing. And so that's how I've written 35 books in as many years.
Ken, what is your writing process? If you're just like writing 3-4 hours a day, is it sort of a process of just putting all your thoughts on this massive document and then sort of trimming it down once you feel like you've emptied the tank?
Yeah, basically. And I'm also kind of weird because when I think of the next book I'm going to write, I usually write most of it in my head. So when I sit down to write, it starts pouring out of me. And I'm just writing what I already know. I've never once had writer's block. It's an experience I don't understand what it's like. Although I've often prayed that I could have it and just get stuck for a while, but I don't. I just sit down and I start writing and I never stop. I don't take breaks. I don't, oh, I've got a coffee maker in my office. And when I start writing, I'll put on a fresh pot of coffee. And then the only time I stop writing is when I get up and refill my coffee mug. So I'll just stop, take my mug, walk over to the coffee machine, pour it out, come back, sit down, and just pick up typing right where I left off. And I'm always typing. It just never stops. And I found that as I introspect on my own life, I find that to be a very unusual way that writers write. It just doesn't happen very often that somebody just pours it out that rapidly. So I've often found that slightly an odd way to write. And it's nothing I can compare with any other writers.
Are you able to speak faster than you type? And if so, what's your thoughts on just voicing out and dictating everything that's in your brain and having someone type it on your behalf? Like, would that double your output and now you're writing twice as many books?
Yeah. I find that I type about as fast as I talk, because I talk at fairly normal speed. A lot of people talk very fast, or there are people that are famous on TV that are known as really fast talkers, like Ben Shapiro, for example, is a very fast talking guy. And I'm sure if he would dictate stuff, that having somebody else type it would make him go very fast. But I don't know if he does that or not. But I've never heard him talk about that. But I generally talk like this. I don't talk very fast.
Ken, what's your thoughts on caffeine? Does it switch you on? Does it allow your brain to move faster, or do you just enjoy the taste of it compared to water?
Well, I've come to enjoy the taste of it. In terms of affecting my brain, I've never noticed that much of an impact on my thought speed. I tend to simply think, well, I think somewhat faster than I talk, but it's not at a racing speed, but it is fairly quick. But coffee's never affected the speed of my thinking.
Got it. And I guess if you don't drink it, you're also the same.
Yeah, basically.
Another thing I've been thinking about is, as I've been writing down my dreams over the last year or so, I've realized that the lessons I've gained from my past experiences and just thinking and visualizing that past experience is the exact same lessons I could take away from a dream. They're both sort of thoughts, and that I can sort of live a double life and get the lessons from past experiences and get the lessons from a dream. But now I'm thinking about it, that's the same as watching a movie and reading a book. You're sort of, so it's nothing that special. It's just sort of learning from other sort of experiences and thoughts.
Right. And that actually is one of the main things that the subtle body does, because it thinks up all of your dream thoughts and spits them out so you can see them very clearly. Basically, when we're thinking, we're using our subtle thought process. That's what it does. And that's why we can use it to learn from, or we can think past thoughts and draw on those as well. And all of that is what our subtle mind does. And it's constantly thinking and producing new thoughts and new ideas and new learning experiences all the time. And whether we're having an actual dream of doing that, or whether we're actually thinking something and writing it for the first time, that is what the subtle mind is all about.
That's beautiful. Ken, what are you currently working on? What are you currently writing? What's the focus for the next 6 months?
Well, I actually just finished my most recent book, and it's called Finding Radical Wholeness. making room for everything in your life. And it's about what it discusses is these 5 major types of wholeness that I briefly went through. So waking up, growing up, opening up, cleaning up, and showing up. It takes each one of those and explains what they are and why they're important. And then it gives examples of practices or exercises that you can do that will put you in touch with that type of wholeness. So I give waking up practices, growing up practices, showing up practices, opening up practices, and cleaning up practices. And it's a very readable book. I like it a lot. I like the way it sounds when I read it to myself. I just actually finished editing, which doesn't take very much of my time. Stuff comes out, it's usually fully the way it is going to appear in book form. I just have always, because I think it because I write it in my head first, it always comes out fully edited and ready to go. But this one did, and I like it a lot. So when I was fairly early in my writing career, I discovered Shambhala publications. And Shambhala was founded by a Buddhist, a Tibetan Buddhist by the name of Sam Burkholz. And he was a follower of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, the drunk womanizing Tibetan teacher. And Shambhala has just, they always did their books with such care, and they were so beautifully done that I just started publishing all of my works through Shambhala. And that's worked out great, because what'll happen is I'll finish writing a book and I know it's done, and I just send it into Shambhala and they publish it. It's just always worked great. So I did my first 5 or 6 books with fairly well-known big name publishers like McGraw-Hill and Random House and Doubleday and those types of publishers. But they were always a little bit of a hassle, and I just didn't enjoy publishing very much with them. But Shambhala has always been a joy and a pleasure. And so I've done, of my 35 books, I've probably done at least 26 or 27 of them with Shambhala. And once I turn it in, it takes them about 5 months to send it through the publishing process and actually get a real book in their hand. 5 or 6 months after I turn it in, it's available. So this book will be available to anybody who wants to get a copy of it in about 5 or 6 months.
Well, that's so cool. What's your process of reading? Do you read at like 2-3x speed and you're reading really quick? Or are you sort of scanning, seeing keywords, slowing down and zoning in that area? What's your method of reading?
Yeah, it's sort of a mixture of those two things. I am a very fast reader, though. And I go through books very, very quickly. I mostly just speed read when I do that. So that's picking up major words and standout phrases and all the stuff you're taught to do when you speed read. But I've been speed reading for quite a while, which is how I go through so many books. And I love the whole process. I love the many books that I read, and I love the fact that I can finish them in a fairly short amount of time, because then I can go on to the next book and the next book and so on. And so it's very useful process for me. And that's the process I tend to follow.
Ken, any recent discoveries that you've been implementing and adding to your life?
Well, I think actually going over all 5 types of wholeness has basically had an impact on my life. because I think about all of these different types of wholeness and how each of them is different, but they all lead to a similar unity type experience. And that was, in a sense, kind of new to me, although I've been thinking along that line for many years now. But it was, at one point, it was a novel understanding. Probably about 10 or 15 years ago, it was a fairly new idea for me. Although I had, when I looked back on it, been writing about each of these areas in one book or another, but I'd never drawn them all together into different types of wholeness. And when that idea started to come upon me, that was a relatively new idea, even though I had written about all 5 of them before. So that was cool. And but it did have a fairly decent impact on my day-to-day life.
That is beautiful. Ken, what's the best place for our audience and people to follow you, absorb your thoughts, get more of Ken Wilber? Is it go to Amazon and just search your name? What's the best places for people to sort of get more of Ken?
Yeah, well, Amazon, you can always start there. And then in terms of books, there are probably 2 books that have sold the most and had the biggest impact. And one is called A Brief History of Everything. And then the other is the book I just finished, Finding Radical Wholeness. And if you read both of those, you get a pretty good idea about what my work is all about. And if you want a really simplified early version, there's a book called No Boundary, which I wrote after my first ever book, which was called The Spectrum of Consciousness. And then I wanted to write a simplified version of The Spectrum of Consciousness. So I wrote No Boundary. And it just deals with the upper left quadrant, or one area of wholeness, but it does a really good job of it. So people will often use No Boundary as the first book that they read. I don't necessarily recommend it, but it's fine if you want to start there. I would start generally with The Brief History of Everything.
Ken, throughout the interview, you sort of do an action where you sort of lick your fingers. Is there a reason for that? What's the story behind that?
I just have dry hands. It doesn't come from anything that I can figure out.
Got it. Thank you so much for your time today, Ken. I could go on forever, but I think you've exhausted the condensed version of my curiosity. And my bladder is sort of starting to beat my sort of focus. But I really enjoyed the time with you today. I could really feel the compassion, sort of the humbleness, the level of intelligence, as well as, I really felt a sense of relief that I've been able to sort of check this tick box and sort of have an opportunity to speak with you before it gets too late. So there's that relief where it's like, I don't want to, in 20 years time, have you be someone that I hoped to have talked to. So I really am grateful for this experience, and I've learned so much and there was so much takeaway. So thank you.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and thank you for inviting me to come on your broadcast.
Thank you, Ken. Guys, if you've made it this far, really appreciate your time. Hopefully you guys gotten some value from today's episode. I'm really appreciative of Ken, and I'll see you guys next week. Peace.
Bye-bye.